church history, a very intriguing study class. I remember when I went to Valley Baptist Church, I'd do a church history class, and people would come. I only started out doing 16 classes. They were very condensed. And people would go into the class, and they'd get in there, and I'd answer their questions. And they would keep me there for 2 or 3 hours, every class. And Marilyn finally got out there, and she started going out in the car and started honking the horn. You know, and I said, I will be here next week if I'm alive, you know. Well, we can't get these things answered from anybody else, you know. Well, I said, that's why I'm teaching this class. I taught, the last class I taught there was 26 or 28 classes. And it still wasn't enough like I really wanted to teach. But it was the best one I ever did, except for this one. Now, this one here is the best. I'm going into more detail with it than we ever have before. We are going through a revolution in America. In all reality, it's a revolution. And we had a revolution before. And the revolution that we had in the past, they fought over all the same things they're griping and following and fighting over today. History repeats itself if you're ignorant and don't know how. If you don't study history, it's going to repeat itself. You will be part of repeating history if you don't study history. Now, in America, we're talking about the last 6 or 7 classes I've done is how the Baptist churches reacted over here in America. You have to realize, now we're coming up to the American Revolution right now. And you have to realize that there was no religious freedom anywhere in the world. Every nation believed that they had to force their constituents, their students, their people, their citizens to go to church, or else they'd be real bad. People even going to church are bad enough. But if you don't church them at all, they figured we'd have an anarchy society. And so they forced everybody to go to church. It was forced. You were taxed when whatever you made your livelihood with, there was a certain amount of tax that you had to pay, and the taxes you paid in early America were not for anything else except for supporting preachers. That was all. And building a church house to keep you in line. Catholicism, the Lutheran Church, Presbyterians, the Anglican Church, Church of England, all of these churches were set in place to keep the people in line, manipulation of the masses. Now, when Baptists came to America, and a lot of people when they came to America, they looked at the Anglican preachers and the Catholic preachers that were here, you know, the priests and everything, and they lived ungodly lives. They were drunkards, they were just terrible. And they did not really deal with the people that much. Except if somebody got put in prison and getting ready to hang, or something like that. They just didn't deal with the men. They got paid, they went up there, they did their little job, their sermons were printed out, they just did what the Church of England or Presbyterian Church or whatever, the Catholic Church, you went through the masses, you did all this, and that was it. When Baptists started preaching in America, it caused revivals. It caused a change of the people itself. The people changed because they were introduced to a real God. A real God to real people. Now, the American, back in New York and up in New England area, there were a lot of Indians up there, and it was the Iroquois Confederation. Now, every Indian tribe in America basically was a democracy. And these people were beginning to get introduced to democracy. The Iroquois Confederation of Faith, if you tied on to this, now every woman, they all voted in the tribe. The women voted and the men voted. It was totally different. They had never seen such democracy. When Thomas Jefferson one among the Indian tribes, he said he'd never seen such a democracy. And then he went into Baptist churches in the business meeting. He said, this is the purest form of democracy that I've ever seen. And they latched on to it. Well, the American people, because they were introduced to the Iroquois and to the American Indian people, and they learned that people could actually rule themselves. See, the Pope, the Church of England, all of this, they said people don't have enough sense to rule themselves. They can't do that. And so God has appointed sovereigns, kings. Now, when the American people began to try to grab a hold of liberty and religious freedom, it was not easy to grab a hold of them. Many of the people had been introduced to the Indian culture, with the democracies of the Indian culture. And then they saw the democracy, the purest democracy, in the Baptist churches where everybody voted, whatever they did. Somebody came here and was saved and wanted to be baptized, the church would vote on that. They would be voting on it. They would vote to receive your member or dismiss you as a member, whichever one. The church would vote on that as a democracy. It's not the pastor and everything. Now, in the other churches, it was the upper echelon. It was the overseers that did this, not the people. It says here, in New York, on the banks of the Hudson, they started to call for, without wavering in faith, in a united American empire. A united American empire. They wanted things different. They wanted to be loose from England. Now, England began to want to ask for taxes from the people, not to support churches now, but now we want the money to go back to England. And then they said, we will not pay taxes when we don't have no representation. Taxes without representation is forbidden. The great dominating idea in America at this time was political liberty. They understood, to a less degree, the liberty of the human conscience and did not fully grasp the conception, even now, at the writing of this book. They were approximately the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Remember what Thomas Jefferson said. The contest was certain to be a long, continued contest for liberty, and would demand exertions and sacrifices beyond anything the colonies had ever done beforehand, heretofore. The forces arrayed against them at time, at home and abroad, were formidable. George III had allied himself with many persons and nations opposed to liberty. They didn't want to lose their seats as kings and queens. You have to realize that the whole world, there was no such a thing as liberty. There was an emperor, and this emperor was a head of the religious society of that nation. And everybody had to correspond to it. When Constantine married the church to the state in 325 AD, the Catholic Church began, and from that time on, from when you were born, they wanted you to be baptized because you became a member of the church and a member of the state. You were a citizen of the church and the state when that happened, the Holy Roman Empire. When they came to America, when Baptists began to come to America, 1638, 1639, Dr. John Clark and others here, Roger Williams, when they came and tried to establish churches, and Rhode Island was the first religiously and politically, what we might call free. You didn't have to go to church. You didn't have to pay tithes to the church. If you didn't believe in it, you didn't have to. Now the Baptists have been hollering for a couple hundred years that they come into these places and they don't believe this Catholicism, and they don't believe the Church of England or Lutheran or whatever was there. They didn't believe that, and why in the world should they be forced to support something that was anti-God and anti-scriptural? They didn't want to believe. They didn't want that to do that. They didn't want that. But they died for it many times. They drowned them. They burned them. They cut their tongues out. They they cut their ears off, cut their noses off, pulled their tongues out, stuck a hot rod through the tongue for preaching the gospel. In our last class, we talked about that. An old man, 65 years old, was arrested when he was getting ready to have a church meeting. He was down on his knees praying to God, and they put their hand on him and said, "You're under arrest for preaching the gospel." They hauled him into court. He ended up losing almost everything he had. They would confiscate all your property. This is what happened to get you where you are today. This is what happened to get you where these people died and bled and suffered loss so you could have religious liberty. He was on good terms with Pope Pius VI and two of the brothers, George III and William Henry, and Duke of Gloucester and Prince Edward Augustus were received by the Pope with great honor in 1777. He wrote to the Roman Catholic bishops, vicars, apostolics, and that kingdom to include obedience to that monarch. Every nation has to have obedience to the monarch, because the monarch is set there by God, they said. God ordains monarchs. He ordains kings. He ordains queens. In that kingdom, to include obedience to the monarch, the good will of George III, said the Pope, makes this virtue a goodness. He is the best sovereign. His authority is full of mildness to Catholics. They do not bear so hard and heavy a yoke. They have been delivered from part of the severe laws and hard conditions to which they were subjected. They now possess privileges of our brethren, may serve in the army, and have obtained Catholic schools for children, for their youth. The Church of England was lining back up with Catholicism because in America they had a threat. Religious liberty. They did not want America to have a religious liberty. They did not want America to have a republic or a democracy. That was forbidden. Nor has a beneficent monarch shown his goodness only to the Catholics of his kingdom. He has favored and supported them in the vast Indian realms, subject to his authority. The Pope was likewise opposed to republics and favored monarchies. Monarchy, he said, is the most natural form of government, and the populace follow no wisdom, they have no counsel, and no understanding of things. The populace has no ability to rule itself. They don't know any better. They don't know how to rule themselves. The appointment of the Roman Catholic clergy in Great Britain was made by Cardinal York, who was a kinsman to George III. Now you have to remember that all of these, Russia, Germany, Spain, England, France, all these people are related. All the kings are. They're all related. Remember in World War I when the German Kaiser declared war on England, and that was his grandma over there that he was declaring war on? Mm-hmm. The hostility of Pope was well understood by the Americans. John Adams, afterwards the President of the United States, writing to the President of the Congress in an official manner in August the 4th, 1770, says, "The court of Rome, attached to an ancient customs, would be the one that last acknowledge our independence. The Pope will never acknowledge our independence. If he were to solicit it, but if Congress will probably send a minister to His Holiness, who can do them no service upon condition of receiving a Catholic legate in return, or in other words, the ecclesiastical tyrant, which it is to be hoped that the United States will be too wise ever to admit into their territories the Catholic Church. The reason for Roman Catholic hostility was manifest practically on all the colonies had severe anti-papal laws on their state books, because the Catholic Church had greatly persecuted everybody in every state, whether it was a Catholic state or colony or not. Likewise, the House of Bourbon had banished the Jesuits from France, and the French favored the claims of the United States. Remember, France and the United States were kind of flopping around together there. The rancor of the Jesuits, says Bancroft, against the House of Bourbon for exiling them from France and Spain was relentless. The Roman Catholic clergy in the insurgent British colonies had been superintended by a person who resided in London, and during the war they were directed by Jesuits who favored the British. The Catholics, always directed by the Jesuits in that country, had been ill disposed to the revolution. They are not better disposed toward us either. It was hoped by some that Canada would make the 14th state in the American colonies, in the American Union, in the American United States. The Quebec Act was passed by Parliament June 1774, the effect of which was to make Canada a Roman Catholic province. Some of the wisest and best men in England opposed this measure. The spirit of the opposition to the act in England may be seen in the attitude of Sergeant Glenn, backed by many other members of Parliament. He represented Middlesex and was the recorder of London. Lord Chatham described him as being a most ingenious, solid, pleasing man, and the spirit of the Constitution itself. He said, "Considering this, sir, that the laws about to be given to the Canadians are French laws, and that the religion, as far as it becomes subject to legal attention, is to be Roman Catholic religion. Remember, you have to pay for the support. You pay taxes to support the state church. And in the colonies of America, every state had a state church. And you had to go to that church or you got fined. And maybe if you just rebelled enough, they would take all your property away and maybe even kill you." Religion, that the Protestant religion is no wise taken notice of then as being one that ought to be tolerated. And that whatever the dispositions of the governor, free from whom they received these laws may be, the government will be as absolute as any king of France could make it. And that without an irresistible necessity, I am persuaded that no gentleman who carefully attends to the subject and reflects upon the consequences can, as a friend of the British Constitution, give this consent to the bill now before us. It says there was not a prominent Roman Catholic in Great Britain who did not endorse the war against America. Let me read that again. There was not a prominent Roman Catholic in Great Britain that did not endorse the war against America. There is important paper to the effect, an address of the Roman Catholic peers and commons of Great Britain to the King, dated May the 2nd, 1776. Remember that? 1776. Now, before America rebelled, guess who was leading out? The Baptists. In 1775, they declared themselves exempt from England. They declared a revolution. And they preached it in all their pulpits. It expresses an appreciation of the Constitution, of their loyalty to it, that for years their conduct has been irreproachable. They're going to stand by the King in public danger and are perfectly ready to, on every occasion, to give proofs of their fidelity. They're ready to fight. Now, in Ireland, in Wales, and different parts of England, there were Catholics. Now you have to realize that the most, what we call rebellious or excitable people were the Roman Catholic Irish. Now many Irish had come to America. They came over here for freedom. And they were going along, and some of them had joined the Confederacy of the United States of America. They had joined the Revolution. But then the Pope sends a letter to these Irish Catholics in America. We beg to assure your majesty that our dissent from the legal establishment in matters of religion is purely conscientious, that we hold no opinions adverse to your majesty's government or repugnant to the duties of good citizens. Remember, manipulation of the masses, the control of the masses by church groups. We trust that this has been shown decisively in our irreproachable conduct for many years past under the circumstances of public discontinuance and displeasure. Then it can be manifested by any declaration whatsoever. In time of public danger, when your majesty's subjects can be one interest and ought to have but one wish and one sentiment, we humbly hope it would not be deemed improper to assure your majesty of our unreserved affection to your government and our unalterable attachment to the cause and to the welfare of our own common country, and our utter detestation of the designs and views of any foreign power against the dignity of your master's crown and safety and tranquility of your majesty's subjects. The delicacy of our situation is such that we do not presume to point out to the particular means by which we are allowed to testify our seal to your majesty and our wishes to serve our country, but we entreat leave faithfully to assure your majesty that we shall be perfectly ready on every occasion to give such proofs of our fidelity, that the purity of our intentions, of your majesty's wisdom, and the sense of the nation shall be any one time deemed excellent. This address was signed by 205 peers and commoners, all Roman Catholics, in America. In America. The acts of the British government were followed by the most solemn protests from all parts of the country. The Crown was asked not to sign the Quebec Act. There were many riots, and the American Congress, October 24, 1774, sent an address to the people of Great Britain. It not only gives the attitude of the Americans in general, but in particular is clear upon the religious side of the controversy. Altogether, it is fearless and plain-spoken expression of convictions. It was signed by George Washington and many others. The risk of the lives of these people in signing that piece of paper was great. Many of the people had great estates here. George Washington was one of the richest men in America, and he signed his name to it. And he was a servant of Great Britain up until this time. You have to realize that he was a loyal citizen of Great Britain. Everything that he did was likewise. After America won the Revolutionary War, George Washington, they wanted to call him their king. He said, we just fought a war over this. Even though you think that I am a great man and I'm a great leader, I will not be your king, because I will not lay down what I fought for to put on a crown. He said, we think the legislature of Great Britain is not authorized by the Constitution to establish a religion, fraught and sanguinary and impious tenets, are to erect an arbitrary form of government in any quarter of this globe. Those rights we as well as you deem sacred, and yet sacred as they are, they have with many others been repeatedly and flagrantly violated. The conclusion of the late war, a war rendered glorious by the abilities and integrity of a minister to whose efforts the British Empire owes in safety and in fame. The conclusion of the war, which was succeeded in an inglorious peace formed under the auspices of ministers, of principles, and of family, unfriendly to the Protestant cause and inimical to liberty. Even after America won the rights of not religious liberty, but liberty from England, people in America still had one idea: the church and the state were one. Baptists were the only people in all of history that believed that. The Quakers came over here, and along with the Quakers, the Baptists fought for religious liberty in this country. But no place else. The Baptists had lived under the auspices of kings and cooperated with them for millennia, hundreds of years. Every place where they did, they were persecuted. Many of them just wiped out, genocide. This was evidently the object of the act, and this view being extremely dangerous to our liberties and we cannot further forbear complaining of it to the hostiles of British America. Separated these considerations, we cannot help deploring the unhappy condition which it has reduced so many English settlers, encouraged by the royal proclamation, promised the enjoyment of all of their rights and have purchased estates in that country. Now they are subjects of an arbitrary government, deprived of trial by jury, and then imprisoned, cannot calm the benefit of the habeas corpus act. Remember now, we had a man in America, a president in America, that thought he was king. His name was Abraham Lincoln, and he set aside habeas corpus. He would imprison people without cause, without even a stated cause, because they had spoken against what he said. This is one of the most tyrannical people in the history of America or in the world. Abraham Lincoln. In the communist countries, when they get ready to fall or something, will do what Abraham Lincoln did. Abraham Lincoln was not the Republican of the day, people. That was a different animal back then. If you want to hear more about that, just go to the classes that I did on how that the presidents of America affected America and all other nations of the world. The great bulwark and palladium of the English liberty. Nor can we suppress our astonishment that a British Parliament can ever consent to establishing in a country a religion that has deluged our island in blood and dispersed impiety, bigotry, and persecution, murder, and rebellion through every part of the world. He's talking about Catholicism. This being true state of facts, let us beseech you to consider what end these things will lead to. Catholic terror. Well, this is class number 1. I hope you learned something from this. I hope you're learning a little bit of American history. When you study American history, you're studying Western civilization, you're studying the history of religion in America. You're studying even the colonization in different colonies in America and what they had to put up with if you were a citizen of those colonies. In the beginning, there was no taxes except to tax you to have you become forcefully a member of the church of the state. And then if you didn't act right, they would imprison you. Because they believed that you had to control a person's mind and his religion, his marriage, and his burial. All of this had to be controlled by the state. And what's happening to us today is a repeat of much of this. Our Father, we send this message out. Please use it to help educate your people with the liberty that you had prescribed in your word. Father, you never beat anybody over the head making them to follow you. Freedom of religion is voluntary by your grace, by your truth, and by your Son. And as you told us to, after we've been persecuted and run out of Jerusalem, go out to all the nations, preach the gospel, baptizing the converts in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And you said, lo, I'll be with you until the end of this age. And sometimes it looks like we're right there at the door, at the end. Father, please use this message for honor and glory. Please forgive me where I failed you. In Jesus' name.